Well, excited to be with you this morning. So great to have you with us. It's an exciting season in our church. As you heard earlier today, the marriage course registration is closing, so you want to register for that. Now, Easter is just around the corner. Easter weekend is going to be unbelievable, and they're going to be talking about that at the end of the service. And I know that while we're talking about COVID and variants and all those things, we continue to be on our plan to phase in a relaunch of our physical locations in May. So an incredible season. So glad that you're with us this morning. Now today, I'm excited to kick off part 2 in our series called Cancel, Jesus' Alternative to a Polarized World. And last week, I talked about cancel culture, what cancel culture is all about. And if you haven't seen part 1, you need to go back and see part 1 because these build on one another 3 weeks. So you definitely want to go and watch that. And today we're going to continue the conversation because we live in an increasingly polarized world. We live in an increasingly polarized world where it seems to be that there's 1 or 2 camps, maybe 3 or 4 camps, but we all seem to be on the extremes. And in fact, in our culture, unfortunately, we're seeing the extremes become even more extreme, where you're seeing actual hate. And even this week, as we saw in the U.S., the Asian American community and just the racism that they've experienced. And we know that in Canada here, there is racism that we're wrestling with and hate that comes on the ends of polarization. We just live in this increasingly polarized world. And because of that, we're trying to wrestle with it all the time. And part of it is the sin in our world and the challenges in our world and the divergent opinions in our world. How do we navigate all of that? Last week we talked about the fact that cancel culture is a suitcase term, that it means a lot of things to a lot of people. You've got cancel culture, you've got call-out culture, you've got boycotting. I mean, there are a lot of different ways to define cancel culture. But in your life and in my life, it's not just something that we see out there, it's something that we can start to do in our own lives. We start to unfollow people. We start to disengage from people in our lives. We start to ghost people. We start to talk about people behind their backs about how we disagree with them. We start to shut out people who disagree with us, and we begin to cancel them. And a big part of cancel culture is shame. The idea of shaming other people for the mistakes that they've made. See, the reason this series is so important for you and for me is because your life is a platform. Your life is a platform. You have the ability to influence the people around you, your friends, your family, your neighbors, the people who you work with. Your life is a platform. If you're a follower of Jesus, I would say your life is a ministry. How do you use your voice in this world? Because you have influence. But how do you use your voice in the midst of a polarized world? Last week we looked at the person of Jesus. Jesus lived in an incredibly polarized world. You had the Jews who were under Roman occupation, and so you had this political polarization happening. And then within the Jewish community, you had all kinds of politics. You had the Pharisees, who were all about living out the law. Then you had the Sadducees, another political religious group. Then you had the Zealots, who were all about, let's overthrow the Roman government. You had the Essenes, who didn't want to stay on the scene. That's how I remember what they're called. And they wanted to stay outside of all of this and lived more in desert areas. It was religious polarization, it was political polarization, and then here, think about this, think Jesus arrives in the midst of the scene and says, the Messiah you've been waiting for? The chosen one that was prophesied about? I'm him. He is a lightning rod in the midst of a polarized world. And in part 1, we looked at how Jesus lived this out in his life. The person of Jesus, John says, was all about truth and grace. Truth is most powerful when it's filled with grace, and grace is most powerful when it's filled with truth. If you haven't seen part 1, you need to go back and see it. And we're talked about if you're a truth person, how do you have more grace? If you're a grace person, how do you have more truth? In fact, you can still put it in the chat today if you're ready to put your hand up and say, I'm a truth person like me. Or maybe you're going to say, I'm more a grace person. And Jesus somehow lived out 100% grace and 100% truth. That's who he was. But today, I want to look at something really granular, a really clear example of Jesus in the midst of cancel culture, in the midst of the shaming that sometimes happens in the midst of a cancel culture, in the midst of our sin, in the midst of moments of justice. How did Jesus respond in the moment of someone being canceled? That's what we're going to talk about today. How did Jesus respond in that moment when someone was being canceled right in front of him? And we're going to look at John 8, 1 to 11. And some of you are going to hear this and you're going to say, well, I don't really normally read the Bible, but I think I've heard people use some of the phrases from this account of Jesus in culture because it's kind of permeated our culture somewhat. And I'm hoping today, if you've read John 8 or you're familiar with this account in Jesus' life, I think today you're going to see this in a really fresh way. How do we respond to a moment when someone is being canceled? Because it does permeate our life, whether it's gossip behind someone's back, whether it's unfollowing someone, ghosting someone, or whether it's publicly shaming someone on social media, where this is kind of all began. What should our response be in moments like that? And this is how the account starts. It says, Jesus returned to the Mount of Olives, but early the next morning, he was back again at the temple. So Jesus is kind of showing up to church, and it says this, a crowd soon gathered, and he sat down and taught them. Now, this wouldn't be uncommon, that people would show up to the temple, and Jesus was seen as a rabbi, and rabbis would teach on the temple grounds, and it's not surprising that a crowd started to gather around Jesus, the most incredible teacher. And they wouldn't stand. There were no TVs. There were no screens. It was just people sitting around in a circle and the rabbi teaching them. And it says, as Jesus was speaking, the teachers of the religious law and the Pharisees brought a woman who had been caught in the act of adultery. Now, first of all, you've got two groups here who are on the scene. The teachers of the religious law and the Pharisees. This is going to be important in a moment. The teachers of the religious law, sometimes called scribes, were the experts in the law. They read the Old Testament law of Moses, and they were the experts in how you were supposed to kind of live out this law. And then the Pharisees, they were more like the enforcers. They wanted to see the Jewish people live every letter of the law in their lives. That was their passion. Their passion was living out the law to the furthest degree and beyond. So you could have teachers who were Pharisees and Pharisees who were teachers, but not necessarily always both. And these two groups are there. And what we see is they bring this woman who'd been caught in the act of adultery. I mean, I want you to think about this. Caught in the act. That this woman was with someone who they think was, one of them was either engaged, the woman or the guy, or that's what they think, or one of them could have been married, or both. And they walk into the hotel room, or they walked into the bedroom, and they're in the midst of the act of adultery. They're in the bed together, and they take this woman, maybe she has a sheet around her, and they drag her out of the room. And they take her and they bring her. And where do they bring her? They bring her to church. I mean, maybe her very first time inside the temple. And they bring her in, and they don't bring her into a private spot. They don't have a private conversation with her. They take her directly in front of this crowd that Jesus is teaching. Think about this. Her first potential religious, spiritual, faith experience is her being shamed in front of a group of people. Half-clothed, embarrassed, condemned, judged, shamed. I mean, this is canceling happening right there in front of Jesus' eyes. Think of how that feels for her. Think of the tension in the air. Think of the emotion driving the conversation. And here's what they say. They say, "Teacher," they said to Jesus, "this woman here, she's caught in the act of adultery. We caught her. It's a gotcha moment. We've looked at her, something that she's done, and now we want to judge her and shame her publicly for it. We want to call her out." And they say to him, the law of Moses says to stone her. What do you say?" See, if you're not familiar of what stoning is, what they would do is literally throw stones at someone until they died. It was capital punishment. And they say, "Hey, when we look at the law of Moses, it says that we should stone her. What do you say, Jesus?" And then it says something interesting. They were trying to trap him into saying something they could use against him. They were trying to trap him into saying something they could use against him. This shows the heart of this group who've brought this woman before Jesus. This shows their true heart. See, they weren't really bringing this woman to Jesus to say, "Hey, Jesus, this kind of behavior is going on in the village and in the city, and we want you to clean it up." That's not really what they were saying. They weren't saying, "Hey, we really feel like justice should be done here, Jesus." That's not what they were saying. They weren't saying, "Hey, we really want to help this woman." I mean, that's clearly not what they were saying. I mean, if this was really about what was best for her, if this was really what was best for the situation, if this is really was about justice, where was the guy? I mean, how come it's just her? I mean, they're actually using her to try to trap Jesus. This group was so agenda-driven that they couldn't even see the fact of what they were doing to this woman. They were so caught up in their agenda to trap Jesus that they were disregarding what they were actually saying should happen to her. I mean, this group had tunnel vision. They had tunnel vision. And their tunnel vision was on their agenda. You know, I think that tunnel vision is something that can happen to you and to me, where we can become so driven by agenda, so driven by our point of view, so caught up in the fact that we're right and everyone else is wrong, so caught up in the fact for some of us that we don't feel right unless we're fighting something. Think about that. That we can get tunnel vision on the situations in our lives, on the people in our lives, on the groups of people that we see. And there's a book called Think Again I talked about last week by Adam Grant, who's a psychologist, teaches at Wharton Business School. He's a business advisor, unbelievably sharp guy. And this book is about the power of knowing what you don't know. And he talks about the fact that biases are what give us, one of the things that give us tunnel vision. And one of the things you see with the Pharisees here is confirmation bias. That's why the teachers of the law are there, because the Pharisees are looking for people to stand with them who will say the same thing they say. That they say, "Hey, let's go to the teachers of the law and let's make sure that they're saying what we're saying." They want to surround themselves with more and more people who think the way they think. They're looking to see what the way they think confirmed. They're not looking for another side. They're not looking to see another version. I mean, they don't even have the time to bring the guy here. They just grab her, and they're looking for these teachers of the religious law to confirm that what they're doing is right. And you and I can do that all the time. You know, we want to judge somebody, and so to justify it, we go to the friends who are going to tell us that it's okay to do that. Or we're talking to some friends, and we gossip about what he posted online or what she posted online or what he's doing or she's doing. And what we're looking for our friends is to confirm, yeah, we're correct in our judgment. that we're looking for confirmation bias when it comes to how we view politics in the world. We've got confirmation bias when it looks to how we look at COVID-19 or vaccines or whatever it is. We don't want to look at all the angles. We want someone to confirm the thinking that we have. That's what the Pharisees are doing. It's tunnel vision. Adam Grant also talks about binary bias. That it's, I mean, I get this. It's so easy for us to just create a good and a bad, and us versus them. And when we think about it, we know that the world is just much more complicated than that. I shared a couple weeks ago that I'm embarrassed to admit this, but when I was younger, I thought people were homeless because they were lazy. And when I got exposed to what was actually happening on the streets and had an opportunity to serve those who were homeless, what I realized in my younger days was, man, homelessness is way more complicated than that. But it's easier, it's simpler, isn't it? To just have, well, it's me versus them, it's good versus bad, it's left versus right, it's blue versus red. It's so much simpler to have a binaries bias because it puts us in the good and it puts them in the bad. But what that bias does is it creates tunnel vision. And that's how the Pharisees saw this. So Jesus, do we stone her or do we not stone her? I mean, those are the only options, right? And then you see desirability bias. I mean, they want this to be true. I mean, they want this woman to come and they want Jesus to behave a certain way. There's a desire for them, an outcome here. And their desire is that Jesus would step in a mistake, that he would make a mistake. See, here's how they were trying to trap Jesus. See, under Roman rule, it was illegal for countries that were under Rome. It was illegal for people to carry out capital punishment. They could practice their religion, they could practice it in any way they wanted, but it was only the Roman government that could actually carry out capital punishment. It's why Jesus himself, when he went to the cross, was judged by Pilate. And so they were trying to trap Jesus out of their tunnel vision. And how were they trying to trap him? Well, if Jesus said, don't stone her, then he's not carrying out Moses' law. And if he says, do stone her, then he's breaking the Roman law. And so they've got him caught. See, they were so focused on making a point and to trap Jesus that they weren't making any kind of difference in this woman's life. I mean, when you cancel someone, when you judge someone, are you focused on making a point and on your agenda or making a difference? Because that's where the Pharisees were at in the midst of this. They got so focused on making their point that they didn't really care about this woman, and they didn't really care about justice. All they cared about was trapping Jesus. And what would Jesus do in the midst of what they've presented as a binary situation? Well, this is what Jesus did. It says, but Jesus stooped down and wrote in the dust with his finger. You know, just stooped down and started doodling in the dust. And this is frustrating them. They say this, they kept demanding, it says, an answer. And they kept demanding an answer. They kept demanding an answer. It says, and so he stood up again and he said, all right, but let the one who has never sinned throw the first stone. See, when someone was stoned under capital punishment, if you were one of the accusers, you had to throw a stone. You had to participate in the execution. And then he says this, it says this, and then he stooped down again and he wrote in the dust. Now, there's a theological debate as to what Jesus actually wrote in the dust because it doesn't say. Some people think he wrote a verse out of Jeremiah, the prophet Jeremiah 17, where it says, those who forsake God their names are going to be written in the dust, they're going to be buried in the dust. Some people think he doodled in the dust because he just had to doodle because he needed thinking time. But there are other people who think, and I tend to wonder whether this is actually what happened. He says, those without sin, throw the first stone. And in the dust, he's writing the sins of those Pharisees, those religious leaders. Jealousy, hate, adultery, and they're seeing their sins written in front of them. Or maybe he's writing the names of the people that these men, the names of the women that they'd committed adultery with. It says, and when the accusers heard this, they slipped away one by one, beginning with the oldest, until only Jesus is left in the middle of the crowd with the woman. Jesus and this woman standing there. The tunnel vision of these religious leaders, of these Pharisees, had created so much arrogance that they were blind to the fact that they themselves had sinned. Adam Grant writes this, he says, arrogance leaves us blind to our weaknesses. Humility is a reflective lens. It helps us to see them, our weaknesses, clearly. He says confident humility is a corrective lens. It enables us to overcome those weaknesses. That tunnel vision and bias and thinking that we always have the corner on what's right without really having the knowledge or the understanding of what's happening where the other person is coming from. It creates weakness. They were blind to their weakness. They were blind to their sin. It says, then Jesus stood up again, and he said to the woman, where are your accusers? Didn't even one of them condemn you? I mean, they dragged you out of that bed. They brought you here half-dressed. And they pulled you up here and they shamed you. One of them couldn't even stand here and say they hadn't sinned. One couldn't stand by the fact that they publicly shamed you. They'd hidden behind their title. They hidden behind who they were. They hid behind their Instagram handle or their Twitter handle. They hid behind their keyboard and they condemned you. And now where are they? When the finger gets pointed the other way, not one of them could stand the test. No, Lord, she said. And Jesus said, these are the sweetest words you could hear from Jesus. He says, neither do I. Neither do I. I mean, grace, such grace, followed by truth. He says, go and sin no more. I mean, you just think of this moment when Jesus stands with this woman in the midst of her shame. And he doesn't leave her. He doesn't turn his back on her in the midst of this shame, but he stands with her. In the midst of her most shameful moment, being shamed by the community around her. And he says, I don't condemn you. Go and sin no more. Do you get how scandalous this is? Because it's not that she didn't do something wrong. It's not that under the law of Moses she didn't do something wrong. It's not that she didn't cheat on someone, that other people weren't being hurt. I mean, all of that was true. She had done something wrong. I mean, he did say, go ahead and stone her if you haven't sinned. I mean, but she had done something wrong. And Jesus says, you know what? I don't condemn you for it. I forgive you. I forgive you. But go and sin no more. Let's make a change. Let's free you from this shame. Let's free you from this sin, and let's point you to a better future. I mean, I can imagine that Jesus is standing there in the midst of her shame. Does he think of the moment when he will be on a cross, dragged, publicly shamed, half dressed on a cross? Just like this woman is. I mean, he would connect with her in such an important way. I mean, culture shames you for your sin and cancels you, doesn't it? You made a mistake, you're judged. You made a mistake, you're canceled. Oh, you did that 10 years ago, 5 years ago, 20 years ago, 20 minutes ago. I'm going to shame you for your sin, and I'm going to cancel your future. It's over. You're judged. You'll never get a job again. You'll never work in this area again. You'll never be my friend again. I'll never have coffee with you again. I'm never going to follow you again. Culture says, I'm going to shame you for your sin and cancel your future. And that's what we do when we're at our worst to people. But this is the scandal of the gospel. Jesus cancels your sin and frees your future. He says, you know what? I forgive you of your sin. I died for that sin. I don't care what it is. I died on the cross. I lived a perfect life and died on the cross for your sin and for your shame. It's not just the things you've done wrong, but the way you've been shamed for them or the way you feel ashamed about them. Jesus forgives that too. Romans 8, I mean, it's so powerful. The first two verses says this, so now there is no condemnation for those who belong to Christ Jesus. Does anyone condemn you? There's no condemnation. There's no condemnation for those who belong in Christ Jesus. It's freedom. He says that. And because you belong to him, the power of the life-giving Spirit has freed you from the power of sin that leads to death. Maybe for you, you've never chosen to follow Jesus. And man, this is an incredible reason to do that. There's no condemnation in him, that he died on a cross for you, for the forgiveness of your sin and to free your future. That when you choose to stand with him, he stands with you in your shame, and he stands with you in your sin, and he says, I don't condemn you, I forgive you, go and sin no more. The shame you feel because of the guilt, or the shame you feel because someone else shamed you, or the shame you feel because other people shamed you, he died for that shame. And he died for that sin. I want you to think about something. I want you to ask yourself this question. Would we be talking about this moment today if Jesus had simply told them to stone her? If Jesus had simply said, you know what? You guys are right. She broke the law. Grab the stones and stone her. I mean, that would have been a normal response in that time. You know why we wouldn't be talking about that? Because it doesn't inspire anybody. There's not really any power in it long term. I mean, who 10 years from now wants to tell their kids, hey, let me tell you about the time I shamed my friend? Let me tell you about the time I shamed this person online. Let me tell you about the time I judged this person. Let me tell you about the time 10 years ago when I was gossiping to my friends about what our friend posted online. That's not inspiring. That's not transformative. That's not the kind of thing that we go, wow, I want to be a part of that. See, Jesus in this moment shows forgiveness and stands with her in her shame and shows grace and truth at the very same time. And grace and truth are powerful. And grace and truth are transformational. And grace and truth, when you see the two together, are things that you never forget and stories that you can't wait to tell for generations. But shame, it's powerful for a moment, but there's no story you want to tell 10 years from now. This week, there's two things I want you to do. If you're feeling shame in your sin, I want you to take some time and think about this. bring your shame to Jesus. The shame you feel about the sin in your life that you've brought to him, bring your sin to him and say, I want forgiveness and I want freedom from shame. I want to be reminded that there's no condemnation in you, Jesus. Jesus, I'm not the best parent. I'm not the best spouse. I'm not the best worker. I've made my mistakes. I ask forgiveness, but I bring you the shame. Remind me that there's no condemnation in you, that I'm free. And then, before you shame someone else because of their sin, remember the cross. Remember the cross. That as Jesus died for your sin and for your shame, he has for theirs too. C.S. Lewis once said, he said, there's no more lovely idea to someone than forgiveness until the moment they actually have to forgive someone. There's no more lovely idea until you actually have to carry it out. But when you do, you are standing in the shadow of the cross. Let's pray together. God, we come to you this morning. And for those who are carrying shame, I pray that your Spirit would free them, as you say in Romans 8, in this moment, and that you would remind them that there is no condemnation in you. And I pray with those who are saying, man, I've never really chosen to follow Jesus, and I realize the scandal of it now, and I want to have a relationship like this. I want to be freed. I pray that you would meet them right where they're at, and they would know your forgiveness and the presence of your Spirit. And God, we confess to you that at times we shame people instead of standing with them in their shame. Help us to live out the scandal of the gospel in our lives. And we pray this in your name. Amen.